One man, one flashlight, one pistol with 6 rounds. That's the entire arsenal Sergeant Harold Roper carries into a hole in the ground barely wide enough for his shoulders. On a January morning in 1966, somewhere in the jungle north of Saigon, above him, the war everyone knows about, the one with helicopters and artillery and air support on call. Below him, a different war entirely, one where none of that exists, where the only weapons that matter are a blade, a beam of light, and the nerve to keep crawling forward into total darkness when every instinct screams to go back. I felt more fear than I've ever come close to feeling before or since, Roper would say later. He wasn't describing a firefight. He was describing a Tuesday. This is the story of the tunnel rats, the smallest, least equipped, most quietly terrifying job of the entire Vietnam War, fought entirely underground against an enemy who had been building this battlefield for 20 years before the first American ever set foot in it. To understand what these men were crawling into, you have to understand what the Viet Cong had actually built beneath South Vietnam's Cu Chi district and how long they'd had to build it. The tunnels didn't start as a Vietnam War innovation. Vietnamese guerrillas had been digging beneath this same stretch of jungle since the 1940s, fighting French colonial forces the same way they'd eventually fight the Americans, by making the ground itself into a weapon. By the time U.S. troops arrived in force in the 1960s, what had started as scattered hiding holes had grown into something closer to an underground city. Roughly 250 kilometers of interconnected passages stretching from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. Hospitals down there, kitchens engineered with chimneys that vented smoke through distant, disguised openings, so no one on the surface would ever connect a wisp of smoke to the war beneath their boots. Sleeping quarters, meeting rooms, ammunition workshops where captured or unexploded American ordnance was quietly disassembled and rebuilt into homemade mines and booby traps, meant for the very soldiers who dropped them in the first place. American commanders discovered the scale of the problem almost by accident in January of 1966, when units of the 1st Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade stumbled onto entrances during an operation that would come to be known as Operation Crimp. For weeks afterward, rear areas kept getting hit by Viet Cong fighters who seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as fast, because they weren't coming from nowhere. They were coming up through trapdoors soldiers had been walking directly over for months without ever knowing it. The obvious solutions didn't work. Tear gas dispersed through the tunnel's own elaborate ventilation systems before it could do any damage. Explosives collapsed a few meters of passage and left the rest of the network completely intact. Dogs sent down to search couldn't tell a booby trap from packed earth until it was already too late. Eventually, commanders arrived at the only method that actually worked, and it was the one nobody wanted to hear. Someone had to go down by hand, in person, and clear each tunnel section by section, in the dark, alone. That job needed a very specific kind of soldier, and the requirements started with something as simple as body size. A man built like an American football player couldn't fit through passages the Viet Cong had dug to their own smaller frame, some tunnels barely 60 centimeters wide and 75 centimeters high, a crawl space built for a body far smaller than the average American infantryman's. So the Army went looking specifically for small, wiry volunteers, men who could fold themselves into spaces that would leave anyone larger permanently stuck in the dark with an enemy who already knew every twist of the passage by heart. Volunteers is the operative word. Nobody was ordered into these tunnels. Over the full span of the war, roughly 700 men volunteered for the job in total, and at any given time, there were rarely more than about 100 tunnel rats actually operating in country, a strikingly small number for a role that would come to carry one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. Captain Herbert Thornton, who helped assemble some of the earliest volunteer teams, described what he was actually looking for in blunt, unglamorous terms: an inquisitive mind, a lot of guts, and what he called real moxie, the specific, hard-to-teach instinct for knowing exactly what to touch and what never to touch, because getting that call wrong meant a man could, in his own words, blow himself out of the tunnel in a single heartbeat. Going down meant leaving almost everything behind. A rifle was useless in passages too narrow to raise it, so most tunnel rats carried a standard-issue pistol, a knife, often the sturdy K-bar blade favored across the military, and a flashlight, sometimes taped so the beam wouldn't betray a man's exact position to anyone waiting silently in the dark ahead. Some men modified their own weapons, sawing down shotguns for a wider spread, in a fight that might happen at a range of inches rather than feet. There was no room down there for a second chance if a weapon jammed. What waited for them wasn't just the enemy, it was engineering built specifically to kill anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. Wired explosives rigged to trip a hidden line, pits lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, sometimes coated in something meant to make even a shallow wound turn septic. In some sections, live venomous snakes were tethered in place at exactly the height and angle to strike a crawling man in the face the moment he pushed past a particular bend. A trap that required no batteries, no timer, nothing that could ever misfire, just patience and biology doing the work. The engagements themselves, when they happened at a range almost nobody trains for. Not room to room. Arm's length, a tunnel rat rounding a blind turn in absolute darkness might find himself closer to an enemy soldier than two people standing in an elevator, both of them reacting on pure reflex in a space too cramped for either man to fully raise a weapon, deciding in a fraction of a second who moved first. There was no cover to take. There was no falling back. There was only the next few feet of tunnel, and whatever was waiting in it, above ground. The danger didn't stop either. It simply changed shape. One veteran's own account, published decades later, noted plainly that most of his unit's casualties actually came not from combat inside the tunnels themselves, but from the parallel, equally dangerous job of locating and disarming the mines and booby traps scattered across the surface terrain surrounding every tunnel complex they cleared. Over one stretch of his own deployment, that soldier's unit alone suffered a casualty rate of roughly 1 in 3, 36 men killed and around 200 wounded, a toll that stood out as brutally high even by the standards of a war that was already brutal by any measure. Allied forces fighting alongside the Americans learned the same lessons the same painful way. Australian Army engineers sent into a newly discovered tunnel system in 1966 with essentially no formal training or precedent to draw on, went in anyway after an enemy fighter inside had already killed 2 of their own men and wounded 2 more men who had never been tunnel specialists at all until that exact moment forced the role onto them. What they eventually recovered from that same complex amounted to an intelligence windfall, but the price for it was a casualty rate over the following years that climbed above 1 in 3 among the volunteers who kept going back down. Despite everything working against them, the darkness, the traps, the enemy that knew the terrain infinitely better than they ever could, tunnel rats kept volunteering, tour after tour, complex after complex, because the alternative was leaving the tunnels intact and letting the war beneath the jungle floor keep killing soldiers from underneath their own feet indefinitely. Recognition for the job rarely matched the risk. Among one Allied unit that absorbed casualty rates above 30% over years of continuous tunnel operations, only a handful of medals were ever awarded for conduct that, by any reasonable measure, called for an entirely different scale of acknowledgement. The tunnels themselves outlasted the war that made them famous. Vietnamese forces defending this same network are estimated to have lost roughly 45,000 people over the full course of the conflict, a number that dwarfs the roughly 700 Americans who ever volunteered to go down and fight them from the inside, and a reminder that whatever this underground war cost the tunnel rats, it cost the people who built and defended those tunnels for 30 years, even more. Today, sections of the Cu Chi Tunnel Network have been preserved as part of Vietnam's war memorial parks, widened just enough for tourists to crawl through a version of what tunnel rats once faced at full size and in total darkness. A strange, uneasy kind of monument, letting visitors experience a controlled, well-lit fraction of a fear that, for the men who lived it for real, never fully left them once they came back up into daylight. This is the story of the tunnel rats, the smallest men sent to fight the largest, most patient enemy of the entire war, one blind turn in the dark at a time.